The Education of OverSoul7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 23. Maha and Sumter, in which Maha speaks through Proteus. Sumter said, "Maha, how much of the dream tribunal do you recall?" "How much do you remember?" Maha asked, grinning at him. "I've the feeling that more happened than you counted on." "Maha, be serious," he said. "Don't Maha me that way, or I won't mix your stock with mine. What a confused baby I'll have. He won't know if he's awake or asleep awake. He? And anyway, you already have." "But nothing's happening yet." She grinned at Sumter seductively on purpose. "I think we should do it again right now, just to make sure." Then she laughed uneasily and shook her head. "I remember the old woman who turned young, I'll tell you that. She was dead and didn't know it. I guess I remember that most of all because, in a queer way, I almost felt like I was her, or a version of her. I can't explain it." "You're doing very well," Sumter said. "You recalled that with no distortion, that is, without any hallucinations of your own. You seem to have those under good control. Is that what happens when I lose the right focus of consciousness?" He nodded. "What else do you remember?" She closed her eyes to think. "A boy, a few years younger than me. But he said that I lived in the past and he lived in the present, and we almost argued about it. He seemed so smug. I said that I didn't live in anybody's past. I live now." Unaccountably, Maha found herself growing angry. "Why should he say that I lived in his past?" "He lives in your future, Maha," Sumter said softly. "Do you know him?" "No, I've never met him before, but he's connected with you, and someday you'll realize how. I can't tell you." Her eyes darkened. "Why not? I'm always in the position of your knowing more than I do. Why can't you just tell me?" "Because I'd rob you of something important." "Not if you have my permission," she laughed. "Maha," Sumter said, "how can you give it when you don't know how invaluable the thing is you'd be giving away?" "Oh, all right," she said, only half convinced. "But tell me one thing. Does that boy really live in the future?" "That's impossible in one way because he wouldn't be born yet." She frowned. "When I was in the outside world, before you found me, I would never have thought anything like this was possible. I mean, everything was now. If I wanted, I could remember past nows, but I never thought of future now." Maha's eyes widened. "Why, that would mean that there was a future now, me to remember me, and you, and all of this. Just saying that gives me the strangest feeling." "The now part is the truest statement," Sumter said. "But you have to go through the past and future stage of thinking to understand it." "Well, I'm more concerned about something else," Maha said. "If I'm going to bear your child, I've a right to know about your people. That is, if what you tell me is true, and a child comes from both of us." "It's true," Sumter said gravely. "But what about your own people? How much do you remember of them? So mysterious in a way that your stock grew out of the earth itself like the trees, literally emerging from the womb. Everything, men and animals, coming from the rich body of the planet, and physically at least returning to it. It's still such an alien concept to me." His eyes were half-lidded, and his tone frightened her. She said slowly, "Sumter, did someone give you training on how to go in body? I mean, on how to live in one, just as you trained me to live out of it and remember?" He stared at her. "Maha, sometimes you frighten me. After showing the greatest ignorance of your own body, mechanics, and the birth of children, then you perceive something like that. I've tried to keep from you, at least for a while. I shouldn't have said what I did. I was just swept away by your own beauty, as I often am. Then to think that this planet of itself produces such fantastic channels through which consciousness can express itself." He broke off. "We still haven't discovered how you knew your way here." "The old man! I remember him now, too," Maha cried. "And I know he's somehow different than I thought he was. That's another thing. He's the one who directed me here. I'm sure of that. And knew of the secret pyramid entrance, too," Sumter said. "The connections are important in terms of what happens to the future of the settlement, and in some ways you're a key to the knowledge." "Stop looking at me like that. I don't know anything I haven't told you. The old man does, though." "Do you want to try an experiment?" Sumter asked. "I have an idea." "No. Suddenly I'm nervous. Rampa and Orona will have a child too, won't they? Born of your people and mine." Maha looked at him quickly, shrewdly, out of the corner of her eye. "Are there more children like that?" He waited before answering. "No," he said. "For several reasons I can't go into right now. It hasn't happened before." She didn't know what to say. The implications of his answer were so startling. "You mean our child could be the first, or Rampa's? According to who gets pregnant first? Orona or myself?" Sumter nodded. Maha said slowly, "Our child won't even know what it was like outside in my world, will it? I've almost forgotten myself. I tried to put it out of my mind, I suppose. It was so terrifying. But I didn't have anything to compare my experience to before I came here. Then I just accepted it." She paused and said, "Maybe I should go back sometime. I'd be frightened now, in a way I didn't used to be, but perhaps I should do it anyhow." Sumter stared at her. "Once you said you'd do almost anything to stay here. But it occurred to me, I don't even know what my heritage is. I call the people out there my people. There are bands of them, tribes. Rampa and I came across them, but they were leery of us, and chased us sometimes. But their children will know that world. So awful in a way. Yet I feel almost frightened right now because I'm so safe and isolated. My people will go their way, and I'll go another." She couldn't look at him. "You're not really thinking of leaving?" "I probably wouldn't even have the courage, but I'd like to see it again." "If you left, you'd change everything," he said. "Oh, why did such an idea come to me? It spoils so much," Maha said angrily. "What I said about my awe of Earth did it, I'm afraid," Sumter said. "I emphasized differences." But suddenly an idea came to her, a way out, a compromise. "I have to do something tonight," she said. "Please don't ask me what it is. I have to do it alone, and I don't want you to follow, even to help. Maybe the Dream Tribunal has something to do with all this. It made me realize how different we are, you and me, how easily you manipulate in ways I find difficult. I'm still an outsider in your world. But your world is on the earth. This is the earth. It's not something apart, Sumter said. Look, trees, grain, flowers, everything is inside here that's outside. But maybe I was meant to go through whatever my people have to go through before they end up with this, your buildings and pyramids and cultivated lands. Maybe I was closer to myself in a crazy way when I was half starving. I have to do what I have to do, or even staying here wouldn't work. You can't go outside alone. You don't know the way. I know it, Maha said. He could read her mind easily and see what she'd planned, but she knew that he wouldn't. Sumter looked at her quietly for a moment. I suppose you want me to leave you alone now. She nodded. I want to think, and I want to sit here and look at the courtyard a while. There was nothing for him to do or say. He nodded soberly and walked away. Maha waited until after sundown. She wanted to be back if possible before midnight, when the speakers would be up and about in their dream bodies. Now she was frightened but determined. Could she remember the mechanics of out-of-body travel well enough to do what she wanted to? Could she master them without Sumter around to help? Could she set her destination, reach it safely, and return? It wouldn't occur to Sumter that she'd try to go back out of body, because he hadn't given her instructions yet on going so far from her physical form, or pinpointing destinations. Maha hoped she remembered enough just from hearing him talk about it at various times. She frowned again. Physically, she didn't even know how to get outside, but unconsciously she must know. And Sumter had mentioned once that unconscious knowledge could be used to direct you to otherwise unknown destinations. Still pondering, she walked back to their private dwelling. When you went out spontaneously, things often took care of themselves, she thought. But all kinds of hallucinations could happen, too, if your body was still sleeping. Yet to grab control consciously, as she was going to do, and direct the journey, you had to do the things that were automatically done for you in a spontaneous dream projection. Maha lay down on her couch and closed her eyes. Willpower alone wouldn't get her anywhere. Yet she didn't want to fall asleep and drift into a dream either. Instead, she started saying mentally, I want to go outside, to the precise spot where I entered this place. Nothing happened. She wasn't being clear enough, she thought. She tried saying instead, I want to stand outside on the other side of the hidden rock door. At the same time, she tried to visualize the spot as clearly as she could from her hazy memory of it. Suddenly her body felt as if it was rocking from side to side. Then she felt as if she was rocking inside her body. There were odd rustlings of sound, like words scrambled or backward, then loud whooshing noises like wind. Be calm. You have to stay calm, she told herself, even while the sounds became louder. What caused them? Later she'd ask Sumter. The wind became a roar. The rocking motions quickened. Something snapped at the back of her skull with an almost sickening thud. And her eyes snapped open. Everything was quiet. She was outside. It had worked. At first she just stood there, staring. So much, yet nothing. The area was full of prickly shrubs and dry high grass. There were no high trees, just cliffs on one side behind her, and mountains in the distance. The mountains contained caves. She and Rampa had used them for shelter often. Her eyes stung. Her dream body eyes, she reminded herself. Her physical body was on the couch, back inside. She and Rampa had traveled from one full moon to another many times without meeting any of their own kind. Why hadn't they ever been in one of the tribes of men, women, and children? They'd been alone together as long as either of them could remember. Then so suddenly, they fell apart from each other when the speakers found them. Why? How drearily everything looked, she thought. She took a few hesitant steps. She could stay on the ground easily enough if she simply told herself that she would, she found. But if she forgot, she'd begin to float upward. But she wanted to walk, to feel the earth against her feet. She stopped. She wasn't doing something right because while she could see and hear, she wasn't feeling, not the air against her face, or the grass against her feet. She concentrated on using all of her senses. Almost at once everything intensified. It was just as if she was in her physical body. She was home. The air had a different aroma somehow, she thought, fuller of wild roots and bushes, but how strange. The air itself had a loneliness in it, an odor of waiting, of suspension. She shook her head, unable to put what she felt into words. The air felt as if it was waiting for people. For an instant Maha felt close to men and women who would come to that very spot. Unseen, but felt voices seemed to murmur around her as if, unbeknown to her, she was surrounded by people in other times, close enough to touch, but divided by some invisible barrier. It was as if, here, outside, she could sense people happening but not formed here in this particular focus. But there was activity all about, as there had been activity and tribes all around Rampa and her, though they'd never come near enough. Never. Maha felt close to some personal revelation, and again she was frightened, overly excited. Yet another part of her was very calm, just waiting for the ignorant parts to understand. She was outside, she thought. When she and Rampa had lived there before, how lonely they'd been. They'd never questioned their isolation. They just accepted it. Now she was shaking. Just who were her people? Where did she and Rampa come from? Why couldn't they remember? And this outside, how far did it go? They'd only traveled so far in it. The speaker's settlement had definite boundaries. How was it that she and Rampa had never wondered about that in the past? Or had they? Did they know and had forgotten? As she stood there, a wind began to rise. It was gentle enough, yet it, too, had odors in it that she couldn't place. How odd, she thought. She looked up at the sky and gasped involuntarily. She'd come from the sky. She knew it, could feel the rush in her belly as she made the descent from far up, down through the clouds. It was impossible, of course. People didn't come from the sky. At first Maha thought that her consciousness was simply confused, but her thoughts were clear and distinct, and her reasoning was functioning. The odd impression continued. She came down, and something like a round bird with open eyes on all sides, from some large settlement, far above the clouds. She descended in a bird of metal that detached itself from something else. And this place now where she stood was different, yet the same. She knew that. But suddenly Maha was floating and her consciousness fluctuated. She saw glimpses of ground, then a tunnel underground. There was a small dog running ahead down crumbled, dark stairs. She was dizzy. Where was she? And where was her body? Then she saw someone who looked like Sumter. Mentally she called out to him, but it wasn't Sumter at all. This had to stop. It wasn't making sense. She was coming out of the pyramid's hidden door now, but the pyramid was no longer as high as it was. The hill was gone from beneath. She was back inside the speaker's settlement. Relief almost made her cry. Then she held her breath. Everything was wrong. Half of the buildings were gone, or crumbled, or just not right. Maha sat up. Sat up? Who sat up? Everything was out of focus. Proteus was terrified. He'd been examining the sound embossing drawings in the courtyard. He'd grown dizzy or dozed for a moment. He wasn't sure which. Then he sat up, and everything looked wrong. He tried to stand up, but he couldn't. What happened? The speaker's settlement was in ruins. Such an unutterable regret and sadness filled him that he felt literally sick. But at the same time he kept thinking, what's the matter with me? I know these are ruins. And why did I say speakers instead of tellers? Yet no matter what he said to himself, or to this other part of him who was so astonished by the ruins, he was still overwhelmed with bewilderment and the deepest desolation. And the part who was so bewildered said, "Of course, the speakers told me how to get here when I came down from the sky. That's how I knew." And Proteus said to himself, "What am I thinking about? The tellers directed me here after I left the sky elevator. But what of it? And why did I say speakers instead of tellers again? I'm arguing with myself," he said aloud. Maha shut off her thoughts. She was back in her body, but someone else was in it. At least, other thoughts were in it that weren't hers. It was the oddest feeling. Or had someone moved her body? Because what she was seeing through the eyes wasn't right at all. Or was her consciousness just confused? She stared. The ruins were still there. Had some catastrophe taken place while she was out of body? But no. These were old ruins, not new ones. Of course they're old ruins, Proteus thought angrily. That was the intriguing thing. The old ruins and the symbol on the tile. The tile, Maha thought. Where was the tile with her sign on it? Proteus shook his head. Why did he want to look at that stupid tile again? It was already driving him out of his mind. There it was. Then this had to be the right place, Maha thought. But she'd left her body on... "Window! Window!" Proteus cried. Window had been working nearby. Hearing Proteus call, he came running over. "Something's happened. I don't know what. I don't know if I can separate myself from what I'm getting." Window squatted down and nodded, but he was alarmed. Proteus' eyes had an uncharacteristic expression, as if they were reflecting another personality entirely. "Proteus?" "Listen," Proteus said. "I'm trying to do something, but it's so hard. Listen, and see if I can do it." He paused long enough for Window to become even more alarmed, then said, tellers is another name for the speakers. This was their settlement. This place is inside in a funny way I don't understand. There's an inside way to get here, besides the way I came. Not a physical way, but a real way. Oh, I don't know if I can keep this up. The tile was signed in the distant past. No, it was 3 days ago, Proteus said, in a quite different, feminine voice. Window bent closer. Proteus, he asked. I'm Maha, the voice said. Where am I? I signed that tile a few days ago. Who are you? You look like Window. Like Window? Proteus thought, way in the background somewhere. In his dream there was a man who looked like Sumter, and the name Window was familiar. He tried to speak, but the odd voice kept saying other things instead, and he couldn't seem to control his own vocal cords. Be calm, Window said. Speak slowly. Proteus managed to get control. Who said that? He asked, dazed. Did I? Then the other voice immediately cried out, These are ruins. What happened? Everything will be all right, Window said. He bent closer, and as he did so, he sensed Maha within Proteus quite clearly. Both of you relax a minute, he said. Get your separate thoughts straight. Don't worry. Proteus took a deep breath, her eyes riveted on Window's face. What year is it? Window asked. October 2254, Proteus said. You're the boy from my dream, Maha cried through Proteus' lips. Where are you? I can't see you. Window, what's going on? Proteus asked. It's Sumter, Maha cried, then forlornly. You look like him, but you're a wrong version. The voice sounded panically. Quickly, Window said, Listen, everything will be all right. You can get back where you belong. You're in the wrong place. Now wait and listen. His voice, so like Sumter's, held Maha's attention. She tried to organize her thoughts and perceptions as best she could. Proteus, you be quiet for a moment, too, so I can help, Window said. I'm named Window because I can see things happen in other times or places. But Proteus, you must be like a psychological window, or looked at from another way, Maha is. Proteus, this time be quiet and let Maha speak if I ask any questions. Will you try it? Proteus nodded numbly. Maha, somehow you got into another reality, Window said. I'm very curious about your own environment, but I'm also concerned about my friend here, and this is a tricky situation. I want you to think hard about where you belong. Picture it vividly, and you'll return safely. Just follow my suggestions. Picture where you want to go. I feel whooshy, Proteus cried. It's gone, or she's gone. Are you all right? I guess so. Was it really someone? We'll talk about it later. You're sure you feel all right now? Just a little shaky. So am I, Window said. To all intents and purposes, you seem to be two different people, and the girl gave some pretty evocative answers, or you did, speaking for her. She lives here in the past, as this place was, Proteus said, awed. Or maybe she's a personification, Window said. No, that's the logical answer, but not the real answer. Still, there must be a connection. No wonder Story felt she was a threat. In a funny way, I could almost follow her, Proteus said. At least I feel that I could, but I'm too frightened to right now, I guess. but I have the impression that she's on a couch opening her eyes. The room was there. Maha looked about. She was in her body. Her relief was making her shake. Her real, lovely, physical body. Laughing and crying, she hugged herself. A few minutes later, she fell into an exhausted sleep. End chapter 23. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.